The morning sun spilled through the tall windows of the Fort Rock Military Courthouse, casting golden lines across the polished oak floors. Dust floated lazily in the light, undisturbed by the murmurs echoing off the high ceilings. It was shaping up to be another ordinary session, a procedural day in the military trial of Major Brandon Kessler. Kessler, a decorated officer with 15 years of service in Army Intelligence Command, sat at the defense table, his posture rigid, his dress uniform immaculate. His face, once confident and composed, now bore the heaviness of a man shouldering blame, whether deserved or not. The charge was grave: gross negligence and mishandling of classified information that had allegedly led to the deaths of 5 operatives during Operation Winterfall, a failed extraction mission buried under layers of national security red tape 3 years earlier. Most Americans had never even heard of the mission, those who had recalled only a headline or two before it vanished from the news cycle. Losses in an unstable region. No further comment. That was the official line. But this morning, something, or rather someone, was about to change everything. Seated quietly in the last row of the courtroom was a woman who, by all appearances, didn't belong there. No uniform, no insignia, no visible purpose. Just a navy blazer, a modest blouse, and a small leather notebook held neatly in her lap. Her name, at least according to the court roster, was Claire Monroe. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, with olive-toned skin, dark brown hair tied in a no-nonsense bun, and a calm expression that betrayed nothing. No makeup, no jewelry. Her presence didn't demand attention, in fact, it avoided it. To the casual observer, she might have been a paralegal, maybe a curious journalist, possibly a law student assigned to observe the case. But to those who were paying closer attention, those trained to notice anomalies, there was something off about her stillness. Something deliberate. She took sparse, methodical notes. Her eyes swept the room once every few minutes, not nervously, but like someone recording every detail, every word, every shift in body language. Those in uniform didn't pay her much mind. Why would they? She wore nothing that gave her rank or relevance. She was just another civilian sitting in on a military trial. But not for long. At precisely 10:42 a.m., Lieutenant Connor Rhodes, a sharp, ambitious JG prosecutor fresh out of Quantico, stepped up to the lectern. His youth and energy were on full display as he delivered a meticulously rehearsed narrative, complete with highlighted maps and declassified mission snapshots. He made a compelling argument Major Kessler had ignored clear protocol during the final phase of Winterfall, aborting the extraction of his team too early, which had stranded them deep in hostile territory. 5 American operatives dead, a failed mission, no accountability, until now. Across the courtroom, Colonel Meredith Blackwell, the presiding judge, kept a firm grip on the proceedings. Known for her efficiency and intolerance for theatrics, she listened with a poker face, nodding occasionally but saying little. She had heard dozens of cases like this before. She expected this one would go the same way. And then Lieutenant Rhodes called his next witness. The prosecution calls Ms. Claire Monroe. A few heads turned. Most didn't recognize the name. She stood slowly, gracefully, and walked toward the witness stand with a posture that was too precise to be casual. Her shoulders squared, her back straight, chin held just high enough. Not in arrogance, but in quiet resolve. Colonel Blackwell eyed her with mild curiosity. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," she asked. "Claire Monroe, intelligence analyst, civilian contractor," the woman answered, her voice soft but steady. The court reporter leaned forward, clearly straining to hear. Rhodes launched into his line of questioning. Claire's responses were clear, well-informed, and deeply detailed, but so quiet they barely carried across the room. She outlined her role in Operation Winterfall: analysis of terrain maps, interception reports, and satellite data. Her findings, she said, raised concerns about local militia strength and extraction viability. She had formally recommended a secondary reconnaissance phase prior to mission approval. "And was your recommendation followed?" Rhodes asked. It was not. Major Kessler didn't flinch. He kept his eyes forward, but his jaw tensed ever so slightly. Major Elias Denton, the defense attorney, a tall man with silvering hair and an air of old-school military decorum, rose for cross-examination. With a confident gait and controlled tone, he began dismantling her credibility. "You say you reviewed intelligence, Ms. Monroe, But from a desk, correct? Thousands of miles away, not in the field. I was assigned to headquarters, yes? So, no first-hand experience of the terrain, the danger, the timing. You were reviewing spreadsheets, not dodging bullets. Objection. Sustained. Still, the insinuation lingered in the air. Colonel Blackwell narrowed her eyes slightly, studying Claire more closely now. Something about the way she answered questions, about how unshaken she remained, even under pressure. Denton pressed again. Ms. Monroe, what level of field experience do you possess, if any? Her answer came after a pause. My field experience is largely classified. The room shifted. The word classified has a way of doing that. A retired colonel in the gallery, his silver hair and faded ribbons suggesting Vietnam or early Gulf deployments, sat forward. His eyes sharpened. Somewhere in his mind, an old memory was beginning to stir. Still, Denton smirked. How convenient. So we're to accept your input on military operations based on experience you can't verify. I'm testifying on intelligence analysis, not tactical command. As the court murmured, Colonel Blackwell leaned slightly forward. Ms. Monroe, I must insist you speak up. The court reporter is having difficulty recording your testimony. Yes, Your Honor, she said, her voice barely louder. The silver-haired veteran in the gallery blinked, leaned forward further, and squinted. His expression changed from interest to alarm. Major Denton sensed the mounting tension and went for the kill. Perhaps Ms. Monroe's unwillingness to speak louder reflects a lack of confidence in her own conclusions. Objection, Rhodes barked. Sustained. Colonel Blackwell snapped. But Claire Monroe didn't flinch. She turned to face the judge. What happened next would change the course of the trial and of 5 families' lives forever. She leaned forward toward the microphone, calmly, intentionally, and whispered 5 words, Shadow Echo 1, 7 Alpha. The words were like a lightning strike. The judge's gavel slipped from her fingers. Major Kessler went pale. The silver-haired colonel in the gallery stood, then slowly sat back down, eyes locked on Claire. Those who knew the code understood immediately. She wasn't just a contractor. She was the last survivor of an operation that officially never existed, and she had just stepped out of the shadows with the truth. The silence that followed Claire Monroe's words was unlike anything the courtroom had experienced before. Not the routine hush of waiting for the judge's gavel. Not the quiet that comes when someone forgets their line or stumbles in testimony. This was a dead silence. The kind that follows a bombshell dropped into a room full of professionals who immediately understand its weight, and a few who suddenly realize they're in over their heads. Shadow Echo 1, 7 Alpha, 5 words, soft as breath, delivered in a tone barely above a whisper. But they landed like a missile. Colonel Meredith Blackwell's hand jerked. Her gavel slipped from her fingers, clattering across the polished bench like a gunshot in a church. Major Elias Denton froze mid-movement, one hand still lifted in preparation for his next question. His jaw slightly parted, eyes narrowed in disbelief. Major Brandon Kessler's face turned a sickly shade of gray. He slowly turned toward the woman on the stand, no longer viewing her as some civilian analyst, but with the expression of a man seeing a ghost who might just destroy the narrative he had been fed and lived with. And in the gallery, the silver-haired veteran, Colonel Thomas Reed, though few remembered his name anymore, stood involuntarily, his knuckles white as they gripped the wooden bench. Recognition flooded his eyes. Claire Monroe, however, remained still. No change in posture. No triumphant tone. No dramatic pause, just clarity. I was the extraction specialist assigned to Operation Winterfall, she said, barely louder now, but every ear strained to catch each word. And I was also the only survivor of Operation Shadow Echo, an off-books mission that Colonel Blackwell herself authorized 3 years ago. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some officers shifted uncomfortably. Others sat motionless, eyes wide, muscles tight. Colonel Blackwell didn't move. For once in her long, decorated career, the ever-composed judge was visibly rattled. You were declared killed in action, she finally said, voice hoarse with disbelief. I know, Claire replied, and I stayed that way because it was safer, for me and for the truth. She reached into the leather bag at her feet. Slowly, deliberately, she retrieved a weathered, blood-stained field notebook and held it up. Its spine was cracked. Several pages were marked with hand-drawn maps, coded coordinates, and detailed mission logs. This contains the original operational directives for Winterfall, she said, not the falsified ones presented to this court. Major Kessler, who had remained frozen until now, whispered hoarsely, "Oh my God, he wasn't the only one." Claire opened the notebook to a page marked with an evidence tag and displayed it for the judge, the prosecution, and the defense. This page details our team's discovery, on the ground, of unauthorized weapons transfers to insurgent groups operating in northern Tirak province. We found American prototype arms in the hands of local warlords. We weren't supposed to find that. That's why the extraction was canceled. That's why we were left behind. You're saying this was intentional? Lieutenant Connor Rhodes asked, voice now subdued, almost reverent. Yes, Claire replied. We were abandoned by command. Not because of tactical error, but because someone powerful needed us to disappear. The courtroom stirred again, this time louder. Colonel Blackwell reached for her gavel, but her hand trembled. Her voice cracked as she spoke. Order. This court will. Claire didn't stop. My recommendation for a secondary recon sweep wasn't ignored by mistake. It was removed entirely from the intelligence packet Major Kessler received. The version he saw didn't include militia activity or the potential weapons cache. He aborted based on orders that came from the very people who were profiting off that silence. And how can you possibly prove that? Denton snapped, his composure returning. He needed to regain control. You expect us to take your word for it? You, a woman presumed dead for 3 years. I brought more than words, Claire said, reaching again into her bag. She produced a small, sealed canister, military-grade microfilm, the kind used to transmit encrypted field intelligence without digital interception. This contains serial numbers, shipment manifests, bank transfer records, all tied to a single source, Lieutenant General Barrett Hadley. He funneled weapons through a private contractor who also fed us the faulty intelligence. Colonel Blackwell's gavel fell again, harder this time, though the impact seemed almost ceremonial, like trying to stop a landslide with a pocket knife. Claire continued undeterred. General Hadley signed the abort order, but here, she produced another sheet of paper, is the original authorization for Winterfall bearing your signature, Colonel. This, she held up a second sheet, is the abort order. The signatures don't match, yours was forged. Gasps turned into open disbelief. I've spent 3 years investigating this, Claire said quietly. Not for revenge, for truth, for the families of the team I lost. For every soldier who thinks they were left behind because of bad timing, not betrayal. Major Kessler suddenly stood, his voice low but audible. I was told the team was already gone when I aborted. That extraction would only cost more lives. You were lied to, Claire said gently. I heard your voice over the comm that day. You hesitated. You asked for confirmation. 3 times. How do you know that? Kessler asked, stunned. Those comms were encrypted. Not everyone in intelligence was corrupted. Claire replied. I had help. The silver-haired veteran stepped forward. Your Honor, I request to speak. Colonel Blackwell nodded automatically, her face pale. I am Colonel Thomas Reed, retired. I trained the original Shadow Echo team. Claire Monroe, Commander Monroe, was the best field operator I ever knew. If she says her team was betrayed, I believe her. Without hesitation. This is still a trial for Major Kessler, Denton interjected. We're here to determine his negligence, not unravel a conspiracy theory. But they're connected, Claire countered. Winterfall was just another chapter in the same story. Same weapons network, same misinformation, different team. She placed one last document on the bench, a communication log with timestamps showing Major Kessler's 3 abort confirmation requests, and the threat of court-martial if he didn't comply. Colonel Blackwell read the page in stunned silence. When she looked up, her voice cracked again. These logs were never submitted with the trial materials, because they were removed, Claire said. Like everything else that could have spared my team. The room fell silent once more, not because of the judge, not because of protocol, but because every person in that chamber understood something extraordinary was happening. A woman they didn't know had just appended everything they thought they understood about duty, betrayal, and silence. And she wasn't done yet. The courtroom was no longer a courtroom. It had transformed, quietly but completely, into something else, a witness chamber for history. Every man and woman present understood they weren't just hearing testimony anymore. They were standing at the edge of a long, buried truth clawing its way back into the light. Claire Monroe didn't rush. She let the moment breathe, let the tension saturate the air like the hush before a storm. I wasn't just reading satellite images, she said quietly, one hand resting on the stained notebook she had placed before the bench. I wasn't just an analyst, and I wasn't operating out of a safe room back in Virginia. She looked up. I was in the field, boots on the ground, during both Operation Winterfall and the mission that preceded it. The mission you knew as Phantom Sierra. A tremor passed through the courtroom. Some gasped quietly, others exchanged stunned glances, but most sat absolutely still, drawn into the gravitational pull of her voice. The kind of silence reserved for eulogies or confessions too painful to speak aloud. I was part of a 5-person unit tasked with confirming the source of advanced American-made weapons showing up in the wrong hands. Our mission was above top secret, ICE-only access. Even our families didn't know where we were going, or that we were ever there. She took a breath, steady but deliberate. We were told we'd be met with minimal resistance, that the intelligence was sound, but it wasn't. The drop site was crawling with hostile militias. We weren't compromised because of bad luck. We were led into a trap. Trap? Colonel Blackwell repeated, her voice thin. Claire nodded. Our team uncovered documentation, on site, linking American prototype weaponry to a private contractor with ties to Lieutenant General Barrett Hadley. Weapons with serial numbers that never should have left Fort Griffin's testing compound were being distributed in Tirak province by intermediaries aligned with insurgent cells. Lieutenant Rhodes, now ghost pale, stepped closer to the bench. You saw this, you confirmed it? We did more than confirm it, Claire said. We documented it, coded it, transmitted it. We sent the evidence back through secure channels before we were overrun. She tapped the notebook. Everything I'm telling you is in here. Field notes, directives, coordinates, even voice logs pulled from comms. But what we didn't know was that our transmission had been intercepted, rerouted, and buried. That was the moment Command decided we couldn't be allowed to come home. The entire room seemed to exhale at once. Not in relief, but in horror. My team, we weren't Kiawe. Not at first. We were alive. We were calling for extraction, repeatedly, but the order never came. A crack appeared in Claire's voice, just a hairline fracture. I heard Major Kessler on the comms that night. He was confused, hesitant. He kept saying he needed confirmation to abort. I know because I was the one screaming for him not to. The major stood slowly, hands trembling. They told me the blast had already taken everyone, that it was too late, that any extraction effort would cost more lives. They lied to both of us, Claire said softly. She returned to the notebook, flipping to a page protected by a thin plastic sleeve. She carefully removed a photo, battered, slightly torn at the corners. It showed 5 soldiers, dusty and smiling, huddled beneath camouflage netting in the back of a convoy truck. My team, she whispered. She turned the photo toward the court, a young woman with a medic's cross patch on her arm, a communications specialist with sharp blue eyes, a sniper who once recited poetry before missions to calm his nerves, a tactical engineer who played harmonica when they were camped in silence, and Claire, her face lean, eyes unreadable, in the far corner of the frame. These were real people. Not just operatives on a spreadsheet. They had families, letters waiting back home, dreams bigger than the battlefield. Colonel Blackwell's expression faltered. Something old and bitter surfaced behind her eyes. I authorized the mission, she said quietly, but I never signed an order to abandon it. You didn't? Claire replied. She handed over both documents, the original mission approval and the forged abort order. Even to the untrained eye, the signature discrepancy was clear. Different angles, different loops, slight variation in stroke pressure. You've spent 3 years carrying the guilt for a call you didn't make. The colonel's hand trembled as she gripped the forged document. I remember that night. Claire continued. When the blast hit the building, I was in the comms room with Staff Sergeant Reeves. He died trying to hold the signal. The explosion threw me through a wall. I was unconscious for hours, Her voice grew quieter. When I came to, the others were gone, trapped under rubble. I tried to reach them, but insurgents were closing in. I ran, wounded, disoriented, and bleeding into my flak vest. She paused. An old shepherd and his grandson found me, dragged me into a ravine, kept me hidden for days until I could move again. By then, the story had already been written. We were dead. The mission had never existed. Hadley was already being fast-tracked for a higher post, and no one was looking for me. The silence was deafening. Lieutenant Rhodes finally managed to speak. Why not come forward sooner? Because I didn't know who to trust, Claire answered. The mission was so far off, books that only a handful of people had clearance, and I didn't know which of them were clean. So I spent the next 3 years piecing together what had happened, following the money trail, matching signatures, identifying which intelligence officers buried my analysis, and preparing for this moment. She turned toward the gallery, toward the rows of family members who had come expecting a courtroom drama, not a resurrection. I'm not here to indict the entire system, she said. I'm here because these people deserve to know that their sons, daughters, and siblings didn't die because of bad calls. They died because they discovered the truth, and someone wanted to bury them with it. Colonel Reed stepped forward once more, his voice gravelly. She's telling the truth. I trained her. I trained all of them. And we always told them the mission is to protect the innocent, even when that means standing alone. Colonel Blackwell's eyes shimmered. Her voice broke as she addressed the room. This court will enter into recess, effective immediately. But Claire wasn't finished. She stepped away from the stand and approached the defense table. Major Kessler looked up at her, eyes rimmed with red. I didn't know, he whispered. I know, she replied. He shook his head. I still don't understand why you'd come back to defend me. Claire placed the photograph in front of him. Because you didn't betray us. The people in that picture knew the risks. We just never expected the danger to come from the inside. She turned back to the judge. I'm ready to give my full statement, under oath, in front of a Federal Review Board, even in front of Congress if I have to. But first, the names of those 5 operatives need to be cleared, their records amended, their families told the truth. Colonel Blackwell nodded slowly, her posture no longer that of a judge but of a soldier acknowledging another. They will, she promised. You have my word? As Claire Monroe returned to her seat, her notebook resting on her lap like a folded flag, there was no applause. Only silence, the kind reserved for the honored dead, and the one who came back to speak for them. It was no longer a question of whether Claire Monroe was who she claimed to be. That had been answered. Now, the courtroom sat frozen in stunned realization, trying to grasp what she had uncovered, and more terrifyingly, who had orchestrated it all. Claire stood again, notebook still in hand. There was no need for a gavel to give her the floor. Even Colonel Blackwell, battle, tested and iron-willed, sat back in silent deference. This wasn't a failure in the chain of command. Claire began, her voice now clear, unwavering. This wasn't a tactical miscalculation or a lapse in communication. She looked directly at the court. It was betrayal, by someone in the highest levels of our military command. A cold murmur passed through the room. She turned a page in the notebook and removed a second container. This one smaller, black, and marked with a red seal. She handed it to Brigadier General Mark Foster from the Inspector General's office, who had been summoned earlier in the day after her testimony sent shockwaves through the military legal system. This microfilm, Claire said, contains transmission records intercepted from Operation Shadow Echo and Operation Winterfall. Embedded within our transaction logs, weapons manifests, and shipment confirmations, all bearing matching identifiers to prototype American weapon systems. General Foster handled the container with care, nodding grimly. We'll secure this immediately. Claire turned back to the court. The serial numbers on these arms match units manufactured at Fort Griffin's Research Division. The weapons were never authorized for deployment, yet they appeared in the hands of local insurgents, days before our team was sent into what we were told was a low-risk zone. She removed a plastic sleeve from her notebook and displayed photographs to the room. One showed a dusty warehouse outside Tabris, crates of American-made shoulder-fired missiles stacked in rows. Another showed a scanned document with the heading COERANCELEVL, Rodictios ONLYINTRNL Turan Serafa Armato. On the last line of that form was a signature. Lieutenant General Barrett Hadley. Gasps spread like wildfire. Claire laid the document on the evidence table. This isn't circumstantial. Hadley's name appears on 5 separate transfer approvals, all routed through a shell contractor named Orion Strategic Solutions. That same contractor produced the faulty intelligence packet that led our team directly into hostile territory. She paused. We didn't walk into a trap. We were sent into it. Colonel Blackwell inhaled sharply. Are you saying Lieutenant General Hadley sold classified weapons to insurgents and issued the abort order on your mission to cover it up? Yes, Claire replied. We found evidence we were never meant to find. The only way to ensure silence was to eliminate the witnesses. That's why our transmission was blocked. That's why Command falsely declared us KIA. That's why the abort order was signed, not by Colonel Blackwell, but by someone who forged her signature. The judge lowered her eyes to the 2 documents Claire had previously presented, the official mission approval and the unauthorized abort order. She placed them side by side on the bench, her lips pressed into a thin, colorless line. Even without handwriting expertise, it was obvious. The second signature wasn't hers. I approve the mission, Blackwell murmured, but I never signed to abandon it. I've been carrying guilt for 3 years over a decision I didn't make. Claire nodded solemnly. And Major Kessler. She turned to the man who had spent every moment of the trial wearing a mask of shame. Followed what he believed were legitimate orders. The brief he was given had none of the intelligence I submitted. My warnings, my assessments, everything was scrubbed. She pulled a 3rd document from the notebook, one with a typed log of Kessler's attempted comms. This is a communication log between Major Kessler and Tactical Command during the final phase of Operation Winterfall. He questioned the abort order 3 times. She placed it gently before the court. It shows that Kessler requested clarification on enemy activity, extraction viability, and safety of the remaining team. Each time, he was told to stand down, and warned that disobedience would result in court-martial. The courtroom was breathless. Kessler looked down at the document. His hands shook as he reached for it. I knew something felt wrong, he said quietly. But I followed the order. I thought, maybe they knew something I didn't. You were meant to, Claire replied. You were another victim of the same deception. Colonel Thomas Reed, the silver-haired veteran who had trained Claire's unit, stepped forward again. This changes everything, he said gravely. This wasn't a mistake. It was a murder dressed up in paperwork. Brigadier General Foster turned to Colonel Blackwell. Your Honor, we've already begun internal inquiry into General Hadley's financial records. The evidence Commander Monroe has presented corroborates a suspicious pattern of offshore accounts linked to Orion Strategic Solutions. Blackwell gave a slow nod. Is he in custody? His security detail was intercepted as of 30 minutes ago, Foster replied. We have him en route to a secure facility. No phone access. No outside contact. For the first time in the entire proceeding, Claire allowed herself a small breath of relief. But she wasn't done. She turned back to the gallery, where several family members of her fallen team sat, still stunned, still unsure whether to hope or grieve. I brought this forward not just to clear my own name, she said. I came back because my teammates deserve to be remembered for the truth, not for a lie that tried to bury them. She reached into her bag once more and retrieved a final set of items. Personal effects, a compass, dog tags, a black and white photograph, a hand-folded letter frayed at the edges. These belonged to them? She said. I kept them safe. I told myself if I ever got the chance, I'd make sure the people who loved them knew how brave they really were. That they fought until the end. That they were betrayed, not lost. The mother of one fallen soldier stood, hands trembling as Claire approached. He was our comms specialist, Claire said gently. He cracked the shipping codes. That discovery was the beginning of everything. The woman clutched the photo to her chest. A father stepped forward, wearing a memorial pin for his daughter. Lieutenant Karen Faulkner, the medic who had saved Claire's life before the building collapsed. She died applying a tourniquet to my leg. Claire whispered. She saved me so I could tell her story. Tears ran down the man's face as he nodded. She always said her job wasn't to fight. It was to make sure others came home. Colonel Blackwell stood now, facing the courtroom. In light of this testimony, the court will initiate formal proceedings to amend the service records of the 5 operatives lost in Operation Shadow Echo. Their deaths will be reclassified as combat KIA, with full honors. She looked toward Kessler. Major Kessler, you are hereby released from custody, pending full dismissal of charges upon final review. Kessler looked as though he might collapse, but he simply nodded, his composure barely holding. As the military police began securing the newly submitted evidence and preparing for transport, Brigadier General Foster approached Claire. Commander Monroe, we'll arrange secure transport to headquarters. Debriefing will begin immediately. Claire glanced once more at the families, then at the courtroom itself, now transformed from a place of judgment into a place of reckoning. I'll come, she said. But first, she turned toward the empty seats once filled by men who never came home. Their story had to be told. By the time the last piece of evidence was laid before the court, the tension in the room had reached a level too heavy to breathe through. What had begun as a seemingly routine negligence case had unraveled into something far darker, something that reached deep into the chain of command and struck at the heart of military honor itself. Colonel Meredith Blackwell sat rigid on the bench, her fingers trembling slightly as they turned over the forged abort order once more. The signature printed at the bottom wasn't hers. She knew it now, but seeing it with her own eyes, laid bare beneath the courtroom lights, still made her feel sick. For 3 years, she had believed she had sentenced 5 operatives to die. She hadn't slept through a single night since. She had read the casualty report herself. She had questioned it, quietly. But like many officers in her position, she'd been trained to trust the system, to assume the machinery above her knew more than she did. And when she asked questions, she was told everything had been handled. That her conscience could rest, it hadn't. Not for a day. Across the room, Claire Monroe stood beside Brigadier General Mark Foster, who was already preparing the chain of custody for the evidence. The microfilm, the notebook, the documents, all of it was now under military police supervision, to be reviewed, verified, and acted upon. But Claire wasn't looking at the officers or the guards. Her eyes were fixed on Blackwell, and finally, the colonel looked up. I believed I'd killed them, she said softly, though the entire room heard it. There was no judicial authority in her voice now, no protocol, no formality. Just a woman staring into the eyes of the soldier who had just given her life back. I signed the mission authorization. Blackwell continued, her voice shaking. I remember the operation clearly. I approved the objective, the location, the timeline. But when the report came back, when I saw that you were gone, when I read that an abort order had come from my office, her voice faltered. She gripped the edge of the bench like it might hold her together. I thought I had killed them. Claire stepped forward, slow and deliberate. She said nothing at first, only opened the notebook one last time and laid it gently before the judge. This is the truth, she said. What's in this notebook isn't hearsay. It's the ground, level, time-stamped, blood-stained record of everything that happened, before, during, and after Operation Shadow Echo. Blackwell stared at the notebook like it might catch fire. Someone forged my name, she whispered. Used my rank, my authority, and let 5 Americans die in my name. General Foster stepped forward. We've already begun verifying the documents. Our internal investigators received an anonymous package containing partial evidence yesterday. Commander Monroe's testimony, and this material confirmed that it came from her. We've issued an arrest warrant for Lieutenant General Hadley, and he's currently in transport under heavy guard. Claire nodded, but didn't look away from Blackwell. There are others, she said. Hadley didn't move that kind of firepower alone. He had support, sign-offs, people who stayed silent for profit or fear, or both. Colonel Reed, standing by the gallery, clenched his jaw. That's the part that hurts most. It wasn't just one man. It was a machine. And we believed it? Blackwell whispered. You were manipulated, ma'am, Claire said gently, just like Major Kessler. Just like every officer who asked a question and was told to stop asking. You didn't sign that abort order. You spent 3 years punishing yourself for something you didn't do. Blackwell's eyes welled. Not the kind of tears that come from sadness, but the kind that only emerge when the weight of guilt begins to lift, but leaves behind bruises. You said the team called for extraction. Blackwell said, voice cracking. That they were alive, begging for help. Claire nodded. We called. Repeatedly. We thought someone would come, that someone would hear us, and no one did. Until now. For a long moment, Blackwell said nothing. She rose from the bench slowly, with the stiff movements of someone coming out of a long coma. Her judicial robes, once a symbol of structure and law, now felt like chains she no longer had to carry. She descended the steps and stood across from Claire, not as judge to witness, but as soldier to soldier. I don't know what to say, Blackwell said, voice nearly breaking. I don't know how to begin making this right. You just did. Claire replied softly. You listened. At that, Blackwell looked at General Foster. I want full access to the investigative process. Every document, every name. I want to be involved in every briefing, every review of the chain of command that allowed this to happen. Don't. Foster said without hesitation. Because if my name was used to justify a crime, Blackwell continued, then my name will now be used to expose it. Applause didn't follow. There was no triumphant music, no standing ovation, just solemn silence, the kind that only comes when a wound has begun to close, but still bleeds underneath. The court recessed formally moments later. Colonel Blackwell's voice, though steadier, had not regained its former command, but there was power in that humility. A woman who had believed herself complicit had instead chosen to become a vessel for the truth. As the attendees rose to leave, Claire remained behind. She stood quietly at the defense table with Major Kessler, who was still too stunned to speak. He looked at her finally. Why did you do all this? Claire smiled faintly. Because they deserved better, and because someone had to speak for them. He swallowed hard. And me? You really think I deserve to walk out of here? You followed the order you were given, Claire said. You questioned it. That matters. Most people would have obeyed without blinking. You blinked. Kessler lowered his eyes. I blinked too late. No, Claire said. You blinked just in time for the truth to come back around. Outside the courtroom, military police escorted the evidence to a secure transport vehicle. A second detail was already en route to escort Claire to Fort Winthrop for formal debriefing. She turned once more toward the empty bench. Colonel Blackwell stood beside General Foster, her posture no longer that of a judge, but of a commander who had just remembered what it meant to feel. Claire offered a final nod. Tell the truth, she said quietly. Even if they try to bury it again, Blackwell nodded. We will. As Claire walked toward the exit, the late afternoon sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the floor. For the first time in 3 years, hers wasn't a shadow of hiding, but of return, and behind her, the walls of silence that once protected the lie finally began to crumble. The courtroom had emptied, but not everyone had left. A handful of people remained in the gallery, parents, siblings, spouses. They had come expecting to witness the trial of a disgraced officer. What they received instead was a resurrection of names they hadn't dared speak aloud for years. Names that, until now, had lived only on grave markers and folded flags. Claire Monroe stood before them, notebook in one hand, a weathered field bag in the other. The steel of her posture was still there, but her eyes softened when they met the gaze of the families, each of whom had been told their loved one died in a tactical accident. She took a few steps forward and stopped in the center of the room. Colonel Thomas Reed and Colonel Meredith Blackwell stood silently nearby. General Foster waited by the door, giving her space. Before I leave, Claire said gently, I need to return something that doesn't belong to me. She knelt beside the bench and opened the field bag. One by one, she lifted out the items. Each piece wrapped carefully in cloth, some with notations, others preserved in small plastic sleeves. Nothing glittered, nothing shined, but to the people who watched, they were treasures. pieces of memory finally coming home. She approached the first woman, a mother in her 60s with silver curls and hands that trembled as they clutched a folded tissue. Her eyes locked on Claire's before dropping to the object in her hand. A silver compass, scratched, dented. The initials JR were etched into the side. "Your son, Staff Sergeant Joshua Reeves," Claire said softly. "He was our communications lead. He cracked the manifest that exposed the weapons smuggling." The woman's lips parted, but no sound came. Claire gently placed the compass in her palm. "He carried this every day. Said it reminded him of hiking in the Rockies when he was a kid. He kept it on a chain clipped to his vest." The woman finally whispered, "He always said he never got lost." "He didn't," Claire said. "Not once?" "Next." She turned to a man in a dark green jacket with a gold pin shaped like a medical cross. He wore it over his heart. His eyes were rimmed with red. "You're Lieutenant Faulkner's father," Claire said. He nodded once, his chin quivering. "Karen. She was our medic." Claire unwrapped a blood-stained fabric bundle. "This was hers," she said, holding out a tourniquet and a folded letter. "She applied that to my leg during the firefight," Claire added. "We were pinned down. I was bleeding badly." She stopped the hemorrhaging before the building collapsed. The man took the bundle, cradling it in both hands. "That sounds like her. Always thinking about others." "She saved my life," Claire said quietly. Her last act was saving someone else. The next person was a young man in his 30s, wearing a black dress shirt and dog tags of his own around his neck. Claire studied him a moment. "You're Justin McCready's brother, aren't you?" "Yes," he said, barely above a whisper. Claire nodded, then pulled out a laminated photograph, creased from years of folding. It showed 5 soldiers lined up behind a sandbag barrier. McCready, the sniper, was in the center, grinning, holding up a piece of cardboard with the words, "We're not ghosts yet," scrawled on it. "He used to write poetry before missions," Claire said, smiling faintly. It calmed his hands. "We never heard him raise his voice." But he never missed. The brother stared at the image, biting his lower lip. "He mailed us one of his poems. After the last deployment. Said he had a feeling he wouldn't come back." Claire reached into her notebook and pulled out another sheet. A handwritten verse, smeared with dirt and sweat. She handed it over without a word. He clutched it to his chest. A woman in her 50s stood next. Her eyes were sharp, but her expression guarded, like someone afraid to feel too much too fast. "Your daughter was Sergeant May Harper, our tactical engineer," Claire said. "She was the one with the harmonica." The woman's eyes widened. Claire offered a small leather case. "She played in the evenings," said. The silence made her nervous. The woman took it, holding it close. Claire hesitated. "She died shielding 2 of us from an explosion." The harmonica was still in her breast pocket. The woman nodded, her lips quivering, but she didn't speak. She only closed her hand around the case and turned away, holding herself still. Finally, Claire approached an older couple, seated together in the back. They looked exhausted. Grief didn't age them. It had settled into their bones. Their son had been the team's mission leader, Captain Benjamin Cross. Claire reached into the bag and pulled out his dog tags. Along with them, a small, battered coin, old, tarnished, but distinct. "His lucky coin," the father said, his voice cracking. Claire nodded. He flipped it before every op. Tails meant he'd go in first. She looked at both parents. It was Tails. He went in first. And he didn't hesitate. The mother took the items with both hands, whispering something inaudible. "I promised myself," Claire said, if I ever got the truth into daylight, I would bring them home. Not just their names, their spirit, their choices, their courage." She looked around at the families. They didn't die because of bad intel. They didn't die because someone hesitated or made a mistake. They died because they discovered a truth that powerful people wanted hidden, and they chose to do the right thing anyway. Tears weren't silent anymore. They filled the space not as sorrow, but as release, as truth finally settling into place. Colonel Blackwell approached slowly from behind, her face drawn and pale but steady. "We're reopening the official record," she said to the group. "Each of their names will be amended, their cause of death reclassified. their service recognized with full military honors. Claire added, their medals won't just be posthumous acknowledgments. They'll be restorations of dignity stolen by a lie. One by one, the family members reached out, some with handshakes, some with hugs. Claire received them all, not with pride, but with quiet acceptance. She had carried these memories like shrapnel for years. Now she was giving them back to where they belonged. As the golden hour sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, painting everything in amber and shadow, Colonel Reed placed a gentle hand on Claire's shoulder. You brought them home, he said. Not in body, but in truth. She nodded. It's all I ever wanted. The courthouse was nearly empty now, save for a handful of people who had witnessed something that would never make headlines, but would be etched in their memory for the rest of their lives. Claire Monroe stood near the center of the room, the late afternoon light glowing faintly on her weathered field notebook. Around her were the remnants of the day tearful families now quiet in thought, stunned officers still unsure how to reconcile the story they'd just heard, and a military courtroom that had, for a moment, transformed into something sacred. At the far end of the room, Colonel Thomas Reed, once the hard-nosed training officer of the now mythic Phantom Echo unit, stepped forward with deliberate calm. His dress shoes echoed across the tiled floor as he made his way to the front. He turned to face the courtroom, his voice strong but low. I trained Claire Monroe, he began. I trained every member of the team you now know as Phantom Echo. He glanced toward the families, then back to the officers still seated in the front rows. They weren't just elite. They were extraordinary. Every one of them could have led. Every one of them could have walked away from that mission once things turned south. But they didn't. He looked directly at Claire, and she, Commander Monroe, was the quiet center of it all. She was the one they looked to when things got dark, and when the world declared them dead, she lived. Not for herself, but for them. A silence followed that was deeper than reverence. Colonel Reed stepped back, his voice now rough with emotion. I buried her, he said. I gave a eulogy at a service attended by her parents, by senior officers, by men and women who thought they knew what sacrifice looked like. But the woman we mourned that day never stopped fighting. He turned to Colonel Blackwell. And now it's time we recognize her not as a ghost, but as what she's always been. Colonel Blackwell nodded and stepped forward, her expression composed but no longer cold. The lines in her face looked softer now, as if the weight she'd carried had finally loosened its grip. She addressed the court with formal clarity. Let the record reflect the following updates and acknowledgments. She picked up a file handed to her by the court clerk, now amended with the new evidence. Commander Claire Monroe, previously declared killed in action during Operation Shadow Echo, is hereby formally reinstated by the United States Department of Defense. Her service record shall reflect full active duty status until the date of her disappearance, with all honors preserved. She looked directly at Claire. You are the recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, awarded posthumously for actions during Operation Shadow Echo. Effective today, that status is corrected. The air shifted again, like something immense had been righted, even if silently. Colonel Blackwell paused, then set her papers aside and looked at Claire, not as a judge, but as a peer. I don't have the words, she said. But I will say this, in all my years of military service, I have never seen such unshakable courage. You didn't return for vengeance. You returned for justice. Claire offered a faint smile. That's all I ever wanted. Blackwell turned to face the defense table. As for Major Brandon Kessler, Kessler stood stiffly, as if unsure if his body was ready to let go of 3 years of tension. Based on the new evidence presented to this court, specifically, forged documentation, falsified intelligence, and repeated manipulation by senior command, this court hereby orders the immediate release of Major Kessler from all pending charges. A gasp rose in the room, followed by the shuffle of seats in a single clap, cut short by the gravity of the moment. Colonel Blackwell added, further proceedings regarding a full dismissal and formal exoneration will commence following the conclusion of the investigation into Lieutenant General Hadley's activities. But as of this moment, you are free. Kessler blinked slowly, His mouth moved, but no words came out. Claire stepped toward him and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You weren't the villain, Brandon," she said. "You were the one they used to finish the job." He looked up at her, barely holding his composure. "How do I live with that?" "Be helping ensure it never happens again," she replied. At that moment, the side doors opened and a uniformed aide entered briskly, carrying a sealed envelope. He handed it to General Foster, who scanned it quickly before addressing the room. "Hadley is now in custody at Fort Pendleton," Foster announced. "Charges include unlawful weapons transfer, falsifying military documents, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit war crimes." Murmurs filled the room, but no one was surprised. Claire turned toward the families once more. "This was never about punishing one man," she said softly. "This was about giving your sons and daughters the truth. They didn't die for nothing. They didn't vanish in some vague mission gone wrong. They were silenced because they found something they were never supposed to see. And they refused to look away." She paused, letting the words linger. "I came back to make sure their names meant something again." Colonel Reed stepped forward once more, facing Claire squarely. "Commander Monroe," he said formally, "the United States Army owes you a debt that can never fully be repaid." He raised his hand slowly and offered her a perfect salute. Claire stood motionless for a moment, then returned the gesture with a precision that silenced the room. Around them, one by one, others stood, a ripple of silent respect. Salutes from officers who just hours earlier had dismissed her as a quiet woman in civilian clothes. Now they saluted a living legend, one who had never asked for the title and never needed it. The moment held like glass. Then, quietly, Claire turned to Colonel Blackwell. "There's still work to be done." The colonel nodded. "And it will be. I promise you that." Claire closed her notebook at last. As she walked out of the courtroom, the shadows from the windows fell behind her, no longer a burden, but a badge. Somewhere outside, the wind shifted, and in a world still full of secrets, the truth had finally been spoken. The courtroom emptied slowly, as if the people inside weren't ready to leave the moment behind. Outside, the light had shifted. The golden hue of early evening spilled through the tall windows, casting long, solemn shadows across the oak floor. It was the kind of light you remembered, because it didn't just warm the room. It made everything inside it feel real, honest, unforgiving. Claire Monroe stood for a moment in the doorway, her hand resting on the worn leather strap of her field bag. The notebook, the same one that had cracked open a 3-year deception, was tucked inside. The signatures, the photographs, the blood-stained maps all secured now, but far from forgotten. She looked back only once. The courtroom was quiet again. Not like earlier in the day when it was stiff with formality and tension, but now with the kind of silence that came only after reckoning. After the lie had died, Colonel Meredith Blackwell remained at her bench, her judicial robe folded neatly beside her. She had removed it after adjourning the session, as if shedding it allowed her to stand as a human being again, not as a symbol, not as an officer of procedure, but as someone who just learned how close she'd come to being a footnote in a betrayal. Colonel Thomas Reed stood beside her, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable, watching Claire with the eyes of a man who had once grieved her funeral, now seeing her rise from it. Claire gave him a small nod, and then, without another word, she turned and walked into the light. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the fading scent of the day, dust, wood, and distant motor oil from the arriving military transports. A black SUV waited by the curb, manned by 2 members of General Foster's Internal Affairs Unit. It was secure transport, destination undisclosed. Only a handful of people knew where she'd be taken. The investigation wasn't over. It was just beginning. Lieutenant General Barrett Hadley was already in custody, isolated and under armed supervision. But Claire knew better than to believe his arrest would be the end. He wasn't the only one who'd profited from the weapons transfers, and the people who helped him scrub those mission files didn't do it alone, or cheaply. She would need to testify again. This time in D.C., she would sit before people in suits instead of uniforms, under brighter lights, with microphones pointed at her from all angles. But it didn't worry her. She'd already done the hard part. She'd spoken the truth when no one expected her to speak at all. As she approached the vehicle, she heard a voice behind her. "Commander." She turned. Major Brandon Kessler stood a few paces back, now out of uniform, his insignia removed, but the memory of them still etched into his posture. He looked older than he had that morning, as if time had caught up with him in just a few hours. "I wanted to say thank you," he said quietly. Claire shook her head. "You don't need to thank me." "I do," he said, "because I was ready to accept that I'd made the worst call of my life. That 5 people were gone because of me. And you stood up and said the thing I couldn't." "You were used," she replied. "So was I. The only difference is, I survived long enough to do something about it." Kessler took a deep breath. "If there's ever anything I can do—" "There is," Claire interrupted. "Don't let this fade. When the headlines go quiet, when the inquiries get delayed, when it's easier to look away, don't. Speak up, write reports, testify, make noise. Because the next time they try to bury something, I may not be around to dig it back up." He nodded. "I will." She offered him her hand. He took it. No salute, no ranks. Just 2 soldiers who had walked the edge and come back with the scars. A few minutes later, as Claire settled into the back seat of the SUV, the driver shut the door quietly. General Foster's aide passed her a folder, briefing materials, probably, or protective orders. She didn't open it. Her mind was elsewhere. She reached into her field bag and pulled out the item she hadn't given away, the final thing she hadn't yet parted with. A coin, a harmonica, a dog-eared page of handwritten poetry. They weren't evidence, they were echoes. And as the SUV began to move, rolling past the courthouse steps and into the glow of sunset, she held them one last time before placing them into a sealed envelope. That envelope would go to the Department of Military Archives, with a note that simply read, "They never asked to be remembered, but they should be." Far behind her in the now empty gallery, Colonel Reed remained at the rear bench. Blackwell had left minutes earlier, walking into the corridor like a woman ready to rebuild from the inside out. She had told Reed one thing as she passed. "The truth isn't clean, but it's still sacred." He had nodded and said nothing. Now, alone in the gallery, he stared at the empty witness stand, where a woman once whispered 5 words that broke the silence and the system. Back in the vehicle, Claire leaned her head against the glass. Her eyes caught the last flare of sunlight slipping behind the trees. The road ahead bent gently to the right, vanishing into the horizon. She didn't know what would come next. Court-martials, Senate hearings, pushback, probably retaliation, but she wasn't afraid of any of it. Because she'd already done the hardest thing anyone could do. She told the truth. And she survived the silence that tried to swallow it. Somewhere far from the courtroom, the names of her teammates were being updated in a secure database, not listed as NIA, not accidental deaths, not operational casualties, but as heroes. 5 souls lost not to missteps or mishandled commands, but to a lie. Now remembered for the courage it took to find the truth, and for the one woman who refused to let that truth stay buried. She reached into her jacket and retrieved the Distinguished Service Cross that had once been mailed to her parents with condolences and silence. She turned it over in her hand. Most people wear their medals on dress uniforms, in ceremonies, or in glass cases. Claire had kept hers wrapped in canvas in the bottom of a rucksack for 3 years. Now, she finally held it in the light. But she didn't pin it on. She placed it gently in her lap, resting her hand on it. Because some heroes never wear their medals. They just carry the weight of them. Some stories don't need explosions or headlines to be unforgettable. Sometimes, all it takes is a woman in civilian clothes, whispering 5 words into a microphone that stopped the world cold. Claire Monroe didn't return for revenge. She didn't come back to be praised or decorated. She came back because truth weighs more than silence, and honor matters more than safety. For 3 long years, she carried the memories of her fallen teammates, the burden of betrayal, and a notebook soaked in truth. She could have disappeared. She could have stayed hidden. But instead, she chose to walk back into a courtroom and whisper a truth that many powerful people hoped would never be heard again. And in doing so, she reminded us of something timeless. Some heroes never wear their medals. They just carry the weight of them. In today's noisy world, we often overlook the quiet ones. The people who don't demand attention, who don't speak loudly, but when they finally do, they change everything. Maybe you know someone like that. Maybe you are someone like that. Have you ever stayed silent when you knew something needed to be said? Or maybe, have you ever spoken up when no one expected you to, and it changed everything? Tell us your story in the comments. Your voice might be the one that gives someone else the courage to speak up too. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that truth still matters, and that duty doesn't end when the mission ends, then please subscribe to our channel. We bring stories like this to light, not for fame, but to make sure the forgotten are remembered and the silenced are finally heard. Subscribe, leave a comment, and share this with someone who believes in quiet courage. Because in a world full of noise, sometimes the softest voice is the one that saves us all.